With the influx of information that we receive on a daily basis, what is a person to believe? When was the last time you really stopped and checked in with yourself to examine how your BS detector was working? Whether you realize it or not, we all operate and think in ways that are influenced by a little something called cognitive biases. What makes a person more susceptible to believing in potentially harmful practices? And how do cognitive biases come into play? Today, I welcome Dr. Laith Al-Shawaf onto my channel to tell us all about what exactly cognitive biases are, what are the practices of woo, and whether or not these can be harmless or harmful in ways that you can safeguard yourself and enhance and increase your BS detector. So stay tuned. We get into the interview today, I just want to say welcome back if you are returning, or welcome if you're new. Either way, I'm always happy that you're here. My name is Rachel Ann. I'm a licensed therapist who makes videos on all things psychological commentary of current events, anti-scams, anti-con artists, and I have a high interest in high demand groups and cults. If this sounds like something that you're interested in, please subscribe so you don't miss any future videos. My guest today, Dr. Laith Al-Shawaf, is a psychology associate professor at the University of Colorado. He has several very interesting projects and books coming out in the near future, so make sure you check out the chapter below so that you can also stay in touch with his latest research that comes out. And without further ado, let's go ahead and get right into the interview today. Hi, Laith. Welcome. Thanks so much for being here.
Thank you, Rachel Ann. It's my pleasure.
Yes, absolutely. So, Laith, if you don't mind sharing a little bit about what really drew you to studying cognitive biases. And I did take a little peek at some other research and articles that you've written. Should you trust the Myers-Briggs personality test? The why is not the same as the how, levels of analysis and scientific progress in psychology. And so I'm interested, what really drew you to cognitive biases?
Well, cognitive biases are just one area that I'm interested in. Like you mentioned, I'm also interested in personality psychology, the Myers-Briggs test, evolutionary approaches to human behavior and psychology, and a variety of other things. But cognitive biases are of interest to me, at least in this context, in the piece that you invited me to talk about, because I think they lead people to some incorrect conclusions, and those incorrect conclusions can be damaging and can be hurtful.
Absolutely. And that almost leads me into what exactly is a cognitive bias?
Sure, yeah. So I think cognitive bias can be defined in more than one way, but a good definition for our purposes is a psychological tendency that leads people astray, a psychological tendency that leads us to form incorrect conclusions. So a good example would be confirmation bias, which is a cognitive bias that we all have, that we're all saddled with. And this is basically the idea that when we encounter information, we tend to process that information in a way that confirms our already held beliefs. So if I encounter ambiguous information that can be interpreted more than one way, I'm likely to interpret it in a way that conforms to my already existing beliefs. And I'm also likely to remember the information I read, to selectively remember the information I read in a way that confirms my already existing beliefs. For example, studies suggest that if you give people passages about some kind of hot button topic, like let's say gun control or death penalty or something like that, and then you ask them to read the evidence presented and recall it later, what people do is they selectively remember the bits that support their already existing beliefs. So if you go into it as somebody who supports gun control, you're likely to read the evidence as supportive of gun control and remember the bits that support your position. And if you're anti-gun control, you tend to go into the study, read the material, and selectively remember the bits that support your position. We're really, really good at this, at encountering information and then interpreting it, attending to it, and selectively remembering it in ways that confirm what we already believe. I'm sure your listeners can tell that's unhelpful for arriving at the truth, because what it means is we tend to entrench our already held positions on whatever topic we happen to be talking about. It's hard to change our minds because everything new we encounter, we interpret it in light of what we already believe, and we interpret it in a way that strengthens what we already happen to believe. So that's a good example of a cognitive bias that I think leads us astray.
Absolutely. It's just a fascinating approach. It's almost that lens that we view the world with. And
Right.
have you noticed that this really develops? And of course, I know we all have core beliefs. Does this really develop over the years and across childhood, maybe ingrained messaging that we receive or messages that become ingrained? What have you observed anything?
Yeah, I think this is a basic human tendency that all of us share. Nobody is really free of confirmation bias or free of the other cognitive biases that we might discuss. Some people might take active steps to try to reduce the extent to which they fall prey to confirmation bias, but it's a very normal, natural human thing. And so, if anything, that's why it's so useful to talk about it, because we all have it. It's universal and widespread. And if we don't guard against it, we're going to instinctively do it. We're going to instinctively fall prey to confirmation bias. And so I don't think it requires particular messaging or particular training. I think it's something that arises in all of us naturally.
That makes a lot of sense. So that is a great segue into kind of going into what you had mentioned in your article, Detecting BS. And you wrote a lot about the concept of woo. And I know in this current age that we're living in, woo has become very popular. How do you define woo? What is woo to you?
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't think there's a very rigorous definition. I think of woo as fluffy, not empirically substantiated ideas that people subscribe to. These ideas often promise something that sort of preys on human vulnerabilities.
Mhm.
So they often promise success or hope or certainty in an uncertain world. And the defining feature to me is that these ideas are not substantiated by empirical evidence. There's just no evidence that they actually work, that there is any such thing as a psychic or a medium, or that homeopathy works. But people are drawn to these ideas. They sound interesting. If they were true, they would be great. And they offer hope, and they offer the promise of things getting better. And so people are drawn to these ideas, but they're not supported by empirical evidence. And it's not just that they're inaccurate. You know, if they were inaccurate and they were harmless, it would probably be fine. But they actually end up hurting people, killing people in some
Mhm.
cases, taking away people's hard-earned cash. And so we tend to think of them as harmless alternatives or harmless beliefs, but in reality, they're not. There's this interesting website called What's the Harm? And it has tracked 1/3 of a million cases of people who have died because of woo related beliefs, and another
Wow.
third of a million who have been injured.
Mm.
And that's to say nothing of all the money lost, people parting with their hard earned cash for BS treatments, or for the promise of speaking to their dead child, you know, that a medium offers them. And these are real people who died because of these treatments. So, for example, there's a 7-year-old kid named Francesco Bonifaz who was given homeopathic treatments instead of antibiotics, and he
Mm.
ended up dying as a result. There's a 25-year-old woman named Sofia Baliakina, and she had a treatable and curable form of cancer, but she was given an alternative treatment that consisted of mosquito bites, mosquito bite treatment. And she died as a result. And Mario Rodriguez, a 21-year-old young man who had cancer and was given vitamin C to treat the cancer. It obviously didn't work, and he ended up dying. So these are, sometimes when we hear the statistics, we can forget that these are real people who had lives ahead of them who literally died because of these treatments. And those are relatively dramatic cases, but there's also less dramatic cases. There's people being injured. There's people losing their money because they pay a lot to these supposed healers who are going to help them, who then do nothing, or who offer them the promise of speaking to a dead loved one and siphon their cash, away from them. And so I think of this stuff as not just inaccurate, but as predatory. It's
Mhm.
callous and it's predatory, and it takes people's money and health away from them.
Exactly. And that's the biggest interest to me, just in really researching and studying the high control and high demand groups and cultic groups, because oftentimes it's so similar. The hook is the promise of some well-being or enlightenment. And it can often take that really dark turn, as you've mentioned. And in fact, I just read an article recently about a woman-led cult who she brought about her own demise after drinking the colloidal silver. And so, it's very problematic. And thank you so much for explaining it. I think that really hits on so many different points. Would you say that the emotional draw, or even that promise for an emotional change, or the medicinal change, would you say that is a common play on why humans can become susceptible? Or could you speak more to susceptibility?
Yeah, susceptibility is a great question because some people are more susceptible than others. And I
Mhm.
think that must be a function of things like what's happening in their life, how hard their current conditions are, as well as certain personality traits may predict greater susceptibility or lower susceptibility. But I definitely think that one thing that's at play is what you're mentioning, that emotional draw of hope that things could be better, hope that if only you envisioned a better life, you could get there, hope that you could be cured of this terrible disease you have with something relatively easy like water treatment or light treatment or crystals. So, hope, the promise of certainty in an uncertain and scary world that's filled with ambiguity, and the promise of things getting better. And we all want that stuff. This is why we're all susceptible, essentially. I mean, first of all, we have these emotional longings for hope and certainty and for things to be better. And second of all, we have these cognitive biases that make us sometimes not that rigorous about what we count as evidence. And if you put those two together, it's a perfect storm for us falling prey to these predatory scams, essentially, that hurt people, but that nonetheless some people really buy into with high confidence.
Absolutely. I always think about just the basic human needs, or maybe not a need, but just the basic human experience of having emotions. And one of the interesting pieces to me when cults develop is there's typically cultural disillusionment taking place. Things are in upheaval, in uproar. And so someone is looking for answers for their problems. And when a group comes through, when someone engaging in woo practices or psychic abilities comes through making these promises, I think it is the perfect match for someone hurting. And so I appreciate your empathetic view, though, because I also agree, and that's something I speak about frequently. Anyone can be vulnerable depending on where you are in life. And so I always like to put it out there, when people start to say that would never happen to me, it may not always be true in that
Yeah.
respect.
Yeah, I agree wholeheartedly. I mean, humans are fundamentally the same the whole world over. We have the same neurocognitive makeup. We have the same minds and the same brains. I mean, obviously, each person's a little different from every other person, but we have the same fundamental neural and cognitive architecture to our brains. We all have the same cognitive biases. We all have the same emotional longings. So any of us could fall prey to this stuff. So it requires cognitive vigilance, and it requires awareness of these biases and
Mm.
actively striving to go against them. Because I think the default setting is us falling prey to these biases. You have to actively work against them. Charles Darwin had an interesting habit that actually speaks to this. He would notice things that seemed to contradict his theory or seemed to be puzzling or problematic, and he would write them down in his notebook and force himself to look at them and read them every day, which is so great when you think about it, because it's kind of like an implicit awareness that we tend to do the opposite. We tend to selectively forget the tidbits of information that don't fit what we already believe. We tend to selectively remember the bits that fit what we already believe or confirm it. And so this was before modern psychology, so there was no term for confirmation bias, but somehow he instinctively knew that humans do this, and so forced himself to come face to face with the elements that seemed to be contradictory. And the point of that is that if you keep doing that every day, what's going to happen is either you eventually realize that your theory is wrong, or you realize that there was some tweak that you missed, or some insight that you needed to add to the theory, some modification that you needed to add. And once you have that new insight or that new modification, it finally explains those puzzling facts, which is what ended up happening with him. But it's a great practice that many of us can engage in. We can, on purpose, face the bits that don't fit what our theories or hypotheses or already held beliefs say, and then we can try to look at them face to face every day and figure out a way to deal with those puzzling bits of information.
Yes, I think that is so well said. And I always think about the modern adaptation that I think is to implementing that practice, even on social media accounts, following people of differing beliefs or viewpoints, and just being exposed to people that think differently.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah. So the opposite of that is deleting, unfriending, and unfollowing people who think differently from you. And I think
Mhm.
that some people do tend to do that. They tend to limit their circle or their bubble to people that they already agree with, which is damaging if you care about arriving at the truth, damaging if you care at arriving at nuanced viewpoints about the world. And so, what you're talking about, purposefully following people that you disagree with, purposefully reading stuff that you might not agree with, that I think is very helpful.
Well, and what you just said definitely speaks to the problematic nature of high control groups, and that oftentimes the MO is to have everyone engage in groupthink, and you're ostracized if you go against the group. And so it's nice to hear you touch on that, because as most people who watch my channel know, that is one of the red flags, is complete adherence to one belief, and anything against it is seen as negative or bad. In your article, and I will try to link this article for everyone watching just so that you can read it yourself, but I think about some of the hot spots that you mentioned, and the ones that you mentioned are very popular. Now, you have touched on some of them, the homeopathic treatments that can come about, but the one that stood out to me is the secret, which was such a popular philosophy. I don't know what you would even refer to it, bunch of gibberish, but we'll let you talk about it. What was your take on The Secret, and what is The Secret?
Well, The Secret is a book and an idea that states that you can change the world and change your life by thinking certain thoughts, visualizing certain images or thoughts, and putting, so to speak, the right energy out there. And what you put out into the world with your thoughts and your envisaging will bring back to you what you're looking for. You can attract things to you by thinking the right thoughts and imagining the right things. Now, causation doesn't work that way, unfortunately.
Mm.
It's an overly facile, overly simplistic way of thinking about things, that you can just imagine things, want them strongly enough, put the right energy. That's the other weird thing about these brands of woo, is they all use the term energy in this wishy-washy kind of way that is essentially undefined and unconnected with the way it's used in physics. They have this interesting tendency to appropriate terms from physics like energy or various things in quantum physics and then misuse them in order to sound more scientific and sound more authoritative, even though the word is being used in a way that bears no relation to its original meaning in physics. So you put the right energy out there in the universe, you think the right thoughts, you envision the right things, and you'll get what you want. And first of all, it doesn't work. That's one problem with it. But there's another problem with it too, which is that it's implicit, and I'm not the first person to point this out, many other authors have pointed this out, but it implicitly suggests that if things aren't going well in your life, like you're poor or you have a disease or a mental health condition, it's basically your fault because you didn't think the right thoughts, you didn't put the right vibes out there, you didn't try hard enough. So it's actually, if you think about it, a mean-spirited and kind of dark view that places the blame on people who are suffering and unfortunate and have had bad luck and who have been dealt a bad hand by life. It more or less tells them that much of what they're suffering through is their own fault for not being positive enough or thinking the right thoughts. Some authors have pointed out, and I agree, that it's kind of mean-spirited in that way and has a dark underbelly. But more importantly, or maybe not more importantly, maybe just equally importantly, that's not how you get good things in your life. You have to work hard, you have to have some luck on your side, other things have to go right, but you can't just create a vision board, think the right thoughts, and put the right energy out there and have things come to you. And one of the problems with all of the different woo hotspots, so The Secret, homeopathy, the Myers-Briggs, psychics and mediums, is that they put forward these views, but they don't have actual empirical evidence supporting them. And all the empirical studies that have been done don't support them, show that they are not substantiated, these ideas. But unfortunately, it seems like it's easy enough to put forward a view, not put forward any or much empirical evidence for it, and yet have people really be taken with that idea if it's an attractive enough idea.
Yes, yes. Well said. Thank you so much for sharing your take on that. I do think that many of these new age philosophies or techniques really center around the use of shame, shaming someone because they didn't think hard enough and manifest something into reality. It's their fault. It's no one else's, it's theirs. And as you know, as most people know, shame keeps a person stuck. And I think that's how people do get sucked into working with a psychic or going to a spiritual new age guru or staying with an unaccredited life coach that is trying to help someone and doesn't have the credentials or theories or technique to back it up. With The Secret, homeopathy, self-proclaimed supernaturalists or psychics, have you noticed that there's a collection of any red flags or things that people should look out for when looking for healing or looking for help?
Well, the first thing is that if it sounds too good to be true, it probably is. If it's easy and doesn't take work and solves all of your problems, and all you need to do is place your faith in someone and maybe your money too, it's probably bullshit. And that's an unfortunate lesson or an unfortunate principle, because we would like things to be easier. But if it sounds like you can easily solve all your problems by just placing your faith in this person or their method, it's probably BS. I think another red flag is one that you mentioned. If there's a kind of groupthink that is so all-encompassing that any deviation from the ideas is viewed as blasphemous or sacrilegious, that's a dangerous sign. A group or a belief system should tolerate some dissent and some different ideas, and there should be vigorous debate. And if everybody thinks the same thing and you're not permitted to think other things, bad sign, I would say. I also think that, some of these principles put forward by homeopathy or by The Secret, they are known to violate things that we know to be true in physics or chemistry or biology. And those things in physics or chemistry or biology, we've studied for decades or centuries and have a lot of evidence supporting them. So if anything goes ahead and violates them or contradicts them on the face of it, you should be suspicious of it because there's so much evidence backing this stuff. For example, in homeopathy, one of the ideas is that dilution increases the potency of a substance. The more you dilute it in water, the more potent the substance becomes. But that just flies in the face of what we know about chemistry and physics. There's also the idea that like cures like. So if you have a disease that you should try to cure it with a similar substance or a similar thing. But there's no evidence for that claim, and there's no particular reason to believe that that's true. Mediums who claim that they can talk to the dead, that flies in the face of everything we know about psychology and physics. if you're being sold something that sounds too good to be true, they require your faith, they require your money, dissent is not really permitted, these are all bad signs. And another bad sign is that the principles of this thing seem to violate decades or centuries of evidence in one of the established sciences of physics, chemistry, biology, psychology. Those are all, I would say, bad signs.
Agreed. Agreed. Very well said. I like how you lined everything out. I do want to add into the financial piece of things. When someone requires you to spend large amounts of money on something, it is always interesting to me because there's a whole psychology in that to pay amount of money, you are almost paying for the belief or buying more so into the belief that something will happen. And I just feel that if that ever happens to someone, you're always allowed to pull out at any point. You don't have to continue on. I almost just feel the need to say that because that is such a heavy piece to, I think, the financial manipulation and exploitation that can happen.
That's a good point. I agree. It's never too late to pull out. There's something called the sunk cost fallacy, which is the notion that, oh, I've already invested so much into this that I can't leave now or I can't pull out now. But that reasoning is unhelpful, and it's actually not a good way of thinking about things, because really the optimal decision at any given moment in time depends only on present and future considerations, not on past considerations. So even if you've already dumped a lot of money into something, it's okay to leave if staying in it is hurting you or is not providing you with a better life. There's a Turkish proverb actually that reflects this. It says, no matter how far you've gone down the wrong road, always turn back as soon as you notice it, or as soon as you realize it. And I love that, because that's true. You know, even if you've sunk a lot of time and money into this thing and now you realize that it's false or unhelpful or leading you astray, it's never too late. As soon as you realize it, you can pull out and get started on a different path.
That's right. That's right. Thank you for sharing that proverb. I think that is beautiful and very in line with what we're talking about, most definitely. One thing that I have received a little bit of feedback on just in having this YouTube channel, and of course, anyone can comment and make statements. I do like to try to come from a place of backing statements I make with research. Yet there are still some folks that believe psychology is a pseudoscience. And so I'm curious to know what your take is on the difference between woo and psychology, and maybe how you can speak to psychology as a field.
Yeah, I think that's a good question. I think that it's all about the method of psychology and the method of acquiring knowledge, the method of testing hypotheses and the method of acquiring knowledge. I mean, the first thing to realize is that psychology is not perfect and psychologists are not infallible. You know, we all make mistakes in research, data analysis, you know, incorrect hypotheses and theories. That's very important to realize. But there's a key difference, which is in how we test our ideas and what is accepted as evidence and what is not accepted. So in psychology, you have to, if you have a hypothesis and you want to convince others that it's correct, you have to test it in a rigorous study. I mean, let's say you think, for example, that listening to bluegrass music improves people's memory or improves people's ability to study a list of words. You actually have to set up a study in which you randomly assign some people to a condition where they listen to bluegrass music, randomly assign some people to a condition where they listen to classical, some people listen to heavy metal, and some people listen to no music at all. And then you have to give them the same list of words with the same studying regimen and give them the same amount of time to study. And then you have to give them a recall test. And then once the results come out, let's suppose that the bluegrass group, they remembered 8 words on average, and the classical music and heavy metal group remembered 7 words on average. Even that's not enough for you to now say that the hypothesis was correct and bluegrass improved memory, because you need to ask the question, well, is the difference between 8 and 7 words big enough to matter, or is it big enough for us to know that it wasn't a fluke or it wasn't due to chance? And so now you have to perform statistical tests on the differences between the groups to see whether the difference was big enough to be very unlikely to be due to chance. And then you need to replicate, do this study again. Preferably a different researcher will do the same study to see if they find the same results, or if the first time the results were due to some kind of anomaly or fluke, or if something else that we're unaware of was driving those results. And so you have to stick your neck out on the line when you have an idea. You have to subject it to rigorous tests. If you think you have a drug that improves memory, then you need to run a placebo-controlled randomized study where the study is double blind, so the patients don't know what they're receiving, whether it's the placebo or the actual drug. The experimenters who are administering the placebo or the drug don't know which one they're administering, and the different groups are tested against one another. Basically, you stick your neck out on the line, by which I mean that you subject your idea to strong tests that could prove it wrong. And that is key. And it's the opposite of what most folks who believe in crystals or homeopathy do. And the reason they don't do that is that the studies that do that show that those ideas don't work, that homeopathy doesn't work, that crystals don't work. In fact, a study a few years ago showed that patients who adopt homeopathic treatments, I think this was for cancer, have a twofold risk of dying compared to those who don't adopt homeopathic treatments. And so when you actually do these rigorous studies where you have controls, where you have placebos, where you do statistical analysis, where you try to do the study again to make sure the first time wasn't a fluke, when you do all of that stuff, you find that these ideas, crystals and chakras and homeopathy and so on, don't work. And that's the key difference, that in psychology, if you have an idea about how memory works or what bluegrass music does to memory or what this new drug does to some aspect of cognition, you have to test it in this rigorous manner I just described. So the key difference is not in psychology or psychologists being infallible or anything like that. There's lots of room for error, and the key difference is in the method of testing hypotheses and the method of acquiring knowledge, and what counts as evidence and what doesn't count as evidence. The other thing I would add to that is that that's the point of science. The point of science isn't that there's some kind of revealed truth that stays the same all the time and it's dictated by old men in white lab coats or something like that. Because sometimes people get a little conspiratorial and they think like science is actually a bunch of gatekeepers who are rejecting our ideas and only permit their ideas. No, the whole point of science is that you change your mind if the evidence shows you that this thing actually works. So if somebody presented me with numerous placebo-controlled, double-blind, randomized studies that showed that homeopathy works, I would change my mind. That's the whole point. So that's crucial to realize, is that science isn't about a list of facts that you're supposed to simply accept. It's about a method for testing ideas. And if enough evidence shows those ideas to be correct or to pass the test, then okay, great, 2 thumbs up, we change our mind. But if they don't pass the test, then we relegate them to the dustbin of woo. And that's the case with these ideas that we've been talking about, is that they don't pass rigorous tests.
Most definitely. So the testing and the very rigorous nature of performing research and gaining approval and then going back and creating new hypotheses is a different world than really what I've kind of observed the world of woo to be, in that almost anyone can posture as an expert and make claims with no scientific backing. But I do think about, Laith, how even someone listening to us today, if they had a particular strong emotional experience that was positive with a woo practice, I almost wonder if their emotional experience would trump research. What do you think?
I think you might be right. And I think that it's difficult to, if you have an experience where it seems to you like something works, you come and you say, no, I actually did. I got this kind of crystal therapy and it solved my back problems. Or I prayed for that relative to survive and they actually did survive. The problem is that when you have this kind of sample size of one, you you don't know if what you think drove the outcome really drove the outcome. What if that person would have gotten better anyway if you hadn't done the crystal therapy, or they would have gotten better anyway if you hadn't prayed? And what if you, because again, we said that everybody has confirmation bias, all of us do. So
Mhm.
what if you selectively remembered certain things in a way that supported your already held beliefs? And that's not a big what if, we all do that. And so a better test would be, you get a bunch of people, a large group of people who suffer from the same problem. You randomly assign half of them to the crystal condition and half of them to a control condition. And then you test them and see what the rate of getting better is in this condition versus the rate in that condition. And then you know whether there's a real difference, especially after you conduct statistical analysis, and especially after you conduct the study another time to ensure it wasn't a fluke or an anomaly. When we just remember something that happened to us once and we feel strongly about it, it suffers from numerous problems. It's a sample size of one. We selectively attended to information and remembered information that conformed to our already held beliefs. We don't know if the person would have gotten better anyway, just with time or just with their immune system. We haven't tested it against alternative possibilities. There's also the fact that patients, because the placebo effect and expectancy effects both matter a great deal. So if a patient believes in a certain treatment and they're getting that treatment, they may start to feel better or to think they feel better because they hold the belief that this works. So it's important to test a large group of people, some of whom believe in it, some of whom don't, some of whom are subjected to the treatment, some of whom are subjected to the control group. Also, it is best practice for the study to be double blind, so the person receiving the treatment doesn't know whether they're receiving the real treatment or the sham treatment, which is placebo of some sort. And then ideally, even the experimenter who's administering the treatment is themselves not aware whether they're administering the real treatment or the sham treatment. That information is held in a notebook somewhere that can later be looked at for the statistical analysis. But if the experimenter knows which one they're giving, then they might, when they give the placebo, their facial expressions and their behavior may be like, this isn't really going to work. But when they do the treatment that they believe in, they may act differently and through their body language convey that they think this is going to work. There's so many things that can go wrong in a study. And that's why it's so important that we have these controls that I mentioned, like the control group, the randomized nature of which participants enter which group, the double-blind nature, and so on. It's important for us to remember, I mean, this is not a problem that only plagues some people or only plagues some ideas. This is a problem that plagues all of us. We're all subject to confirmation bias. We're all subject to thinking that anecdotes count when they're not rigorous enough. And so basically, it's on all of us to remember that there are better, more standardized, more rigorous ways to test our ideas. The reason it matters is because, first of all, you want to have a true view of the world and how things work. And second of all, you don't want you or your loved ones to die or be hurt or to waste money on practices that don't help them. It actually matters in money and lives and injuries. So it's a very, very practical thing for people to adopt these rigorous standards when they're trying to figure out what to believe.
Yes, could not agree more. As you were talking, I was visualizing a puzzle being put together because all the pieces do have to fit. And that could be said even in avoiding swindlers or folks who will take advantage of you. It's recognizing the things that you shared. If it seems too good to be true, it probably is. And then understanding, has there been other information, other sources to back up the efficacy or not? And I guess one of the last questions, and this kind of goes into the sample size of one that you mentioned, but is this where also receiving anecdotal advice can maybe be problematic to a degree?
I think so. I think that, I don't, for example, I try not to trust my anecdotal experiences and my memories because I know my memory is fallible. I pay attention to ideas that already confirm what I believe. And I'm not special in that regard. We're all fallible and we all have those cognitive biases. So it's best to subject our own anecdotes and our own beliefs to this kind of rigorous test, as well as the anecdotes that we hear from our friends. If somebody says, my mom had this disease and she tried crystal therapy and it worked. Well, was that tested against a control group? Would she have maybe gotten better without the crystal therapy? Did she believe she was going to get better because she already believed in the efficacy of crystal therapy? Did the person administering it feed her information that led her to believe that it would work? So every time we or our friends have an anecdote like that, they really need to be tested against alternative explanations and tested against controls. I say in the article that, adding anecdotes, and we're filtering those anecdotes through our own personal cognitive biases. It doesn't get us very far. The anecdotes are limited in the information they contain, and then we filter them through our cognitive biases, which makes our interpretation of them even more suspect. And so you can't build an edifice based on that kind of shaky foundation. You need a more rigorous foundation than that. One thing that comes to mind is whenever these ideas have been subjected to rigorous tests, they haven't worked. So a famous example is, just one example, is James Randi, the famous magician and illusionist and also debunker. He famously had that, I believe it was $1 million prize that he offered to anybody who was able to show under reasonable experimental conditions that they actually could have supernatural powers or predict the future, be clairvoyant or talk to the dead or bend spoons with their mind or whatever. And nobody ever was able to claim the prize money because once you remove all the tips and tricks of the trade and you force the would-be psychics or the would-be mediums to actually do their thing under experimental, double-blind, rigorous conditions, the ability falls apart and they're no longer able to do it. And so when
Very
those
interesting.
ideas yeah. So when those ideas have been, when it's been a put your money where your mouth is kind of situation, show us that you can do it. We'll televise it and it'll be double blind and we'll have all the controls set up. When that has been the case, it has invariably not worked.
Very telling. And like I said, very interesting. Great share. I also want to put it out there. I mean, I think that a good distinction, and I would love to hear your thoughts, but a good distinction, if somebody anecdotally gives you a great recipe or something that isn't of great significance and won't vastly negatively impact your life, that's one thing. But I just want to make it clear that for the sake of this interview today, and is that we're talking about the practices that could be very harmful and potentially really endanger a person. And so do you agree with that? I mean, if it isn't going to be vastly impactful on your life, that's one thing.
Yeah, totally. I definitely agree. I mean, this is not our advice that we're offering now is not don't listen to your friend's music advice or don't listen to your friend's
Yeah.
advice. The point is that when folks come to you with a new therapy that's going to cost you a lot of money that might end up not working and thereby killing you or harming you, that's when you need to be really rigorous and skeptical of the claims they make. Listening to, as you suggested, a new recipe or a new song that your friend suggests or whatever, that's a great idea. For one thing, it doesn't have this impact on your health and your money. And for another thing, they're not suggesting a fundamental thing about the world. They're just sharing with you something they like and they want you to partake in it. And it would be great to share that thing with them. But my concern, and I think it sounds like your concern too, is people being misled, their money being taken from them, their health being harmed based on these swindling techniques and these therapy techniques, homeopathic and alternative treatments that don't work. The only thing they do work for is making the practitioner a lot of money. They fatten their pockets. That money comes out of the sufferers into the snake oil salesman's pockets, and then people's health gets impacted. And that's a really bad deal for us. And that's why we need to be so cognitively vigilant about what we believe and what we don't.
Yes, could not agree more. Any final thoughts? Anything else that really comes to mind for you that you would like to just impress upon folks listening in?
I like the notion, there's a famous quote that says, science and everyday life cannot and should not be separated. And I really like that idea because It's not like science is divorced from everyday life. Science is just a method for acquiring knowledge, a method for testing our ideas to see if they're true or false, or if we should provisionally accept them or not. And so when we're living our everyday lives and we're trying to figure out how to solve an electrical problem in our house, or how to solve our kidney problem, or how to help our loved ones with their cancer, it really is important to use the scientific method to figure out what works and what doesn't, and what we should believe and what doesn't. It's not like you can separate the two and say, we use science in the lab, but this is my everyday life, and so I'm going to go by faith, or this healing practice that I heard about that my friend says works. And you really should adopt the rigorous epistemic boundaries and the cognitive vigilance for this thing too, because it matters in your life whether your health and those of your loved ones are protected. So that's one thing that comes to mind. And then the other thing that comes to mind that I would really emphasize is that the whole point of science is to test ideas, to reject those that don't work. And if the ideas turn out to work, then to accept them. And so it's not like science or scientists declare by fiat what is true and what is not. Instead, it's an ever-evolving, ever-changing thing where if a new treatment idea comes up, you test it. And if it works, then great. And it becomes accepted into the fold as a working, successful treatment. And that's important because I think that sometimes people think that science is a bunch of like old fuddy-duddies who have decided what's true and what isn't, when in reality, it's just a method for testing ideas.
Well said. Staying open, but also staying vigilant.
Yeah. I think forming beliefs about the world requires curiosity and openness to new ideas, but it also requires skepticism and a demand for rigor about those ideas. And it can be hard to walk that line, but we have to keep both in mind all the time. If we're too open, there's this quote, which I think is kind of funny. It says, it's great to have an open mind, but if you open your mind too much, your brain might fall out, which I've always thought was pretty funny. It's the idea that, yes, you should be open to new ideas, absolutely. But you need to vet all of those ideas through a rigorous screening process as well.
Yes. Are you currently working on any publications or upcoming books that you want to share with us? And when could we expect to have those out?
Sure. So I am working on a few things. The book that's coming out this year is going to be called The Oxford Handbook of Evolution and the Emotions.
Ooh.
And that's a book where my co-editor and I solicited chapters from many different experts in the field. Each expert wrote one chapter. And so there's more than 60 chapters in this book, and it's divided into 4 sections. It's basically about emotions and understanding emotions, in particular from an evolutionary perspective, and understanding how emotions relate to many other domains of life, like how they relate to politics and status navigation and the legal system and friendship, and emotions in dogs and emotions in the great apes and emotions in morality. And what are emotions? How can we understand them? How can we understand specific emotions like shame, regret, guilt, happiness, pride, joy, etc., and so forth? How do these emotions relate to the other domains of life that I just mentioned, politics and morality and friendship and forgiveness and so on? And then also, how do emotions play into and what is their role in psychopathology? So borderline personality disorder, narcissistic personality disorder, a bunch of other disorders as well, post-traumatic stress disorder, eating disorders, etc. So that book should be coming out this year.
It sounds great. I will most definitely grab a copy from my library. If someone wanted to read some of your articles, where would be the best place that they could find you or find your articles to read?
Yeah, okay, thanks for asking that. I think, well, first of all, I'm on Twitter and I release all of my new work there in case anybody is on Twitter and wants to find me there. My handle, it's at Laith Al Shawath. My name is spelled Laithal SHAWAF. So at Laith Al-Shawaf, and I release all my new work there. But if folks want to find my pop science essays in particular, I have a bunch of them on Psychology Today. That appears in my blog, which is called 6 Impossible Things Before Breakfast, which is named after the sequel to Alice in Wonderland, Alice Through the Looking Glass.
Very nice.
I also have a bunch of pop science essays on Areo magazine. Areo is spelled AREO.
Wonderful. Well, thank you for sharing. Thank you so much for being here. This has been so fascinating for me and sure to help many people. So I really appreciate it.
Thank you. It was a pleasure.